Hi, Misha here, and in the past I talked about getting this model. This is a Corgi 1/144 scale diecast of the Boeing B-52F. So it's kind of I guess you call it late first generation. And it's really a very neat model, and I was happy to find this on eBay a year and some change ago. I'd like to have another one, but these have been out of production for some time, making them rather hard to find. But then during their warehouse clearance, Aikens found a B-52C and a B-52H. Now the C is very similar to the F, but the H has some differences. And I waited and waited, hoping someone would buy the model. After like 3 weeks or of whatever being on the website, they didn't, so I kind of just had to. One of those things. So with that, I thought we'd look at these models a little closer and talk about the variants. The B-52, known as the Buff, Big, Ugly Fucker, was really meant to be an interim measure aircraft until the B-70 Valkyrie came online. But the Valkyrie never really came to be, at least production. And the B-52, even though it had a little bit of a rocky start in the 50s, by the 1960s it had proven itself to be a very capable aircraft. It was originally designed as a strategic bomber, a nuclear bomber, but thankfully it's only been used in the conventional bombing role and has been used quite extensively, from Vietnam to the Gulf War to the Afghanistan and Second Iraq War, and even into more modern conflicts like Syria. They built 744 of these between 1952 and 1962, when the last of the H's came out. And today, over 50 are still in service, with even more in reserve. And there are no plans to retire these before at least 2040. So, yeah, a pretty long-lived aircraft. It is nearly 160 feet long, with a 185-foot wingspan. It can carry up to 70,000 pounds payload and bombs. Early versions, it was just all in an internal bay. Later on, they would add 2 and then 4 pylons on the wings. Has a crew of 6 and an extremely good range, especially since it is capable of air-to-air refueling. Original versions could go up about 8,000 miles. Later versions could extend that as much as 12,000. It has a top speed of about 650 miles per hour and a cruise speed of about 550 and a maximum ceiling of about 50,000 feet. It's just a big, dependable bomber, but on the other hand, it is a challenging one to fly, and its record is far from spotless. But with that, yeah, let's look at the differences between the early versions, the B, the C, the Ds, the E's, and the F's, and the later versions, the G's and the H's. Really, in this video, I mostly would just want to talk about the difference in these two models, the difference in variants, but anywho, the B-52's origins go all the way back to right after World War II, late 1945. At that time, they were hoping to have an interim bomber, still propeller-driven, to replace the B-29 and to come after the B-36. In 1946, Boeing was given the initial contract, which would evolve into the XB-52, and to really skip forward, there was a lot of back and forth. But 2 things happened that really pushed this design. Boeing actually wanted to go to a turbojet engine. It was the Air Force, at least some members, that were resistant. Finally, they gave way and decided that they would. Also, the Air Force became independent and developed aerial refueling, which helped with the whole range requirements. Originally, they had 2 prototypes ordered. One would be built as an XB-52. The second one would actually be a YB-52. And the reason it was called this was because of the budget to fund it, where it came from, government stuff. Then there would also be, in 1951, a production, or rather, really a pre-production order for 13. At the end of 1951, the XB-52, the first prototype, was rolled out, but during ground test, taxi testing, it had an incident that caused a good bit of damage. Therefore, it was actually the YB-52 that first flew in April of 1952. But XB-52 would be restored and would fly in October of that year. As for the 13 models, they were all going to be B-52As, but only 3 of these were built, and they were basically incomplete. They were not combat capable, combat ready. And the 3 that were built were used for testing and trials, actually for quite a long time. The 10 remaining in the contract were turning into B-52Bs, and these were the first ones to be fully ready to go. They had full avionics, full targeting systems, and they had the tail gunner here. There was one guy sitting way in the back. He had 5 50 cal Browning guns. He could interact with the cockpit, but he would have to go all the way from back here, all the way to the front. And that was not a pressurized tunnel. In the cockpit, we had 2 decks. Now, the original 52 design had a tandem seat on the upper deck for the pilot, co-pilot. This was very quickly changed to side-by-side seating. And then below those 2 crew were the 3 other operations officers. You had your weapons officer, your electronics, your navigator. They were on the lower deck. And this dual cockpit system actually was an issue. The top cockpit, because of all the windows and the systems, tended to be hot. But the guys down below, because of the high altitude flying and what have you, tended to be rather chilly. Now, all 5 guys in the front had ejection seats. The pilot and co-pilot, they ejected upwards. The 3 crew below them ejected downwards. And the guy in the back, he didn't have an ejection seat. The best he was given, this little tail gun assembly could be shot off from the aircraft, and I guess hopefully he would strap a parachute on and be okay. Being a tail gunner sucks. The crew liked to have him back there because he was a great observer. He also had a parachute below here. This is such a big aircraft that to land, it had to have its roll slow down, so there was a parachute under the tail here. Originally, the wing had flexible fuel bladders in it. And then we have 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 engines. We have 4 landing gear sets on the fuselage, plus an outrigger on the wings. And by the time of the B-52C model, which is actually, well, I should say they made about 50 of the Bs, the first combat capable one. And then with the C, they only made 35. And the main thing there is they went to larger tanks here. You can see it's a pretty darn large tank. And they did a few things like they gave curtains to the cabin in case of a nuclear blast. And that was, again, the original role. In fact, the Strategic Air Command was the main advocate of the B-52. Although there was also the RB-52, at least in principle, where this could be used as a reconnaissance Instead of having a bomb bay with the bomb bay systems in it, it could have a reconnaissance pod. And one kind of neat thing, the pod that would have gone inside had 2 additional crew members in it, increasing the crew to 8. This was done to appease others in the Air Force, but I don't think it was really ever used much. So much so that the next version, the B-52D, was a dedicated bomber. It no longer could accommodate the reconnaissance package. Just wasn't really needed. Now the B-52E, by the way, they would build about 170 of the Ds. So pretty good production run. The E was an interesting change. The E was actually designed for low altitude. Originally, these were high altitude bombers, which was the 1950s. But after the U-2 was shot down, the Allies realized that Russian missiles, SAM technology, was progressing, and that low-level bombing was the ticket, not high altitude. Because low-level, they didn't give the missile the radars time to lock on. They used the earlier versions, the C's and the D's, for this, but with the E, they specifically reworked the airframe, the wings, and what have you for low-altitude performance. Now, it wasn't perfect. In fact, pretty much the entire fleet would have to be re-winged and reinforced throughout the 60s because low level was taking its toll. You see this with a lot of the British bombers, the V-bomber series too. These 1950s big old aircraft just were not designed for low altitude flying, which also meant more maneuvering, what have you. But yeah, the E was the first for that, and they would build about 100. And now we come to the F here. They build about 89 of these. And the main difference, this went to an uprated with more thrust version of the Pratt & Whitney J57 engine. And I had a few other nominal improvements. It's worth saying the first of these was delivered in 1958, and they were able to produce these so quickly because Boeing was building them both in Washington and Kansas. But the F version would be the last one built in Washington. After this, all production would be done in Kansas, freeing up the Boeing plant in Seattle for other projects, including commercial liners. The F's also important because this was the first one to see combat. In 1965, these were used in Operation Arclight in Vietnam and continued to see their tour of duty until 1966 when they were replaced with the B-52D model. And they had modified, I think, around 100 of the Ds to have the big belly or wide belly, meaning they were specifically set up to carry conventional bombs. The 750-pounder, they could carry a lot of them, was common, although they could carry a pretty wide range of payload. That's because this was primarily designed as a nuclear bomber. And Strategic Air Command really jealously guarded its B-52s. It took a lot to convince them to release them to conventional bombing roles, but with the war in Vietnam, they didn't really have a choice. Of course, they would and did. But the F would return to the nuclear patrol duties. And with that, by the late 60s, we would see the earlier versions, the B's and the C's retired, and then followed by the E's in the 70s. And finally, the F's were retired in the mid to late 70s. So by 1979, the Air Force is flying the B-52D out of the early series, and of course, the later G's and H's. So let's take a look and see what the difference is. At first, we'll call it second generation, whatever. Next generation may look the same as the F over here. And broadly, yes, after the really early versions, the design was pretty stable. But in 1959, the G would be introduced. This was intended to be the final version. The B-70 was coming online, so it was thought that the B-52 would soon be supplanted. Now, the deal with the G, this was kind of a midlife extension, I guess you would say, of the program. They moved the tail gunner, and they actually took him completely out of the back here. And where he used to be, they moved the drag chute to. A little better position for that. And he got to join the rest of the crew up front, and he operated his tail gun remotely. They also went to a longer nose for more advanced avionics, including new computers. And they shortened the tail fin by quite a bit. It's worth pointing out that the fins on B-52s can fold for going in low hangars. Kind of neat. And finally, they went to a new wing, a new wet wing. They finally put actual fuel tanks inside versus the bladders. This addressed some leaking problems they had with the F. And because of this, they went to smaller wing tanks, which obviously caused less drag. And a myriad of other avionics updates and changes. They would also introduce 2 pylons inside here for cruise missiles, ironically called hound dogs, although many would be used over the years. Anyway, they would deliver 193 of these, meaning the G version was the most produced. But with more delays in the B-70 and other things, it was decided to go with this exact model here, the B-52H. And this was built as a launch platform for the upcoming Skybolt missile. And for that, they would have 4 pylons, 4 hardpoints on the wings. They would reinforce the wings, and they would go to a new engine finally. And you can see it on this model. Maybe they did mold the new engine style. And by this point, for a tail gun, we have an M61 rotating barrel 20mm cannon instead of 4 50 cal machine guns. And they would build 102 of these, with the last one coming off the production line in October of 1962, so right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the G's and the H's were considered the more modern version. They had the more modern cockpit arrangement, the bigger nose for avionics, and probably most importantly, the wing pylons with the internal fuel storage. This would make them infinitely upgradable, almost literally so. So yeah, they would mostly keep the G's and the H's on nuclear duty throughout the 60s, leaving the F's and then the D's for Vietnam. And the D's would be upgraded a bit in the 70s, some of them anyway, and then the final D's were taken out of active service by 1983, give or take. At the same time, the G's and the H's were being updated. They would get all kinds of new missile compatibility, standoff missiles, cruise missiles. They would get new electronic countermeasures. One cool thing that was introduced in the 60s, they could carry 4 robot drones that would fold up and then come out of the bomb bay, and actually when they were fully deployed mimicked the radar signature and behavior. They could even have some course changes programmed into them to fool Soviet radar. Kind of a neat little thing. So they would update them, giving them GPS eventually, giving them more modern computers. They would even finally try to improve the crew accommodation with better climate control. They would have some basic stuff in there for heating up tea or whatnot. All kinds of various little things done to some of the G's and really most of the H's. The one thing that kind of held the G back, though, was it used water injection for its engines, which by 1980s was kind of an outdated technology. So they did kind of plan to start removing them. First, they would switch many of the remaining G's to conventional bombing role, and then they would start to phase them out in 1989, slowly. But then, 1990, Operation Desert Shield would lead to the 1991 Gulf War. So in January, at the beginning of the Iraq War, the first B-52 Gs would hit Iraq. First, they would come in low, using guided cruise missiles to hit their targets, and then later they would operate from high altitudes once Iraqi basically anti-aircraft ability had been taken out. And nearly half of the conventional bombs dropped on Iraq were thanks to B-52s. At this time, they were mostly keeping the H's back to continue the nuclear role, leaving the G's to kind of do the conventional bombing role. And they had very good acclaim. A couple were hit by Iraqi SAM missiles. Well, SAMs. But they both made it back to base. Another one was hit by a friendly HARM, a radiation missile, but it too made it back to base. The only loss of a B-52 came when one had an electronics failure and would crash in the Indian Ocean returning from its mission. And these planes during the Iraq War were flying all over the place. The B-52H, especially thanks to the new engines, they were more fuel efficient. They were also quieter, which pilots appreciated. And this took, they could go 12,000 miles without refueling. And with refueling, these airplanes did 35, 40-hour missions. Some of them did even over 45-hour missions. Luckily, they did have some air masters just to catch a little time on. And again, they had very basic cooking facilities. One hopes they also had a toilet, because opening up the door to take a piss at the altitudes would not be the most fun thing. So yeah, the Iraq War, the first one, kind of gave the G a longer lease on life. But after that war, in October of 1991, it was decided to finally remove the tail gunner. They would pull the 20mm cannon out of the back, feeling that it no longer had any utility whatsoever, and this would reduce the crew from 6 to 5. They would also stop routine nuclear patrols at this time because the Cold War was ramping down. And by 92, retirement of the fleet of Gs resumed. So around 1994, 1995, the last Gs were pulled out of service, but the H models were still going strong. In fact, they were continuing to be upgraded and updated with modern technology. Therefore, they were used in Afghanistan and Iraq, and continue to see updates for modern missiles. They could carry up to 20, and they could carry smart munitions, JDAMs and stuff. So they continued to update them. Of course, even though they're still in service today, they're not exactly young airframes, but they also aren't at the end of their lives with routine maintenance. Really, the biggest problem is just training young pilots to fly a 1950s era aircraft. This isn't fly-by-wire. It's not an all-digital, all-glass cockpit. It's considered a very challenging aircraft to fly, and it always has been. Even back in the 50s, they usually put experienced air crews in these, and that kind of continues today. It doesn't handle like a fighter. It handles like a giant aircraft that it is. It's kind of sluggish, slow to respond. But on the other hand, it has a very large, respectable lift capability. It can mount a lot under the wings, a lot inside, and again, it's very upgradable. It's also the opposite of being stealthy, for again, pretty obvious reasons. But it has very dependable engines. It's fuel efficient, again, long range. There's a reason that it's still in service today. We have about 50 in active status, with another 20 or 30 in reserve. The reason it's at 50 now, not greater, part of it is arms treaties and agreements, but a lot part of it is just what's needed and the cost of keeping that many going. And modern technology, modern combat, just doesn't dictate the need for hundreds. It's a bit